This is our final week of history, if you can believe that, and we are going to cover several important events of modern history. And in this sense, I mean modern history in the sense of after World War II. The word modern itself technically refers to everything from the late 1500s on, as difficult to believe as that is. But when we usually think modern, we usually think of events that occurred within the lifetime of ourselves and our grandparents or so. That would be modern times. And so today we're going to talk about the Korean War. On our next lecture, we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we will conclude with Watergate. As far as lectures, of course, there's other events that we will be talking about in our class-to-class discussions, so don't worry if you wonder what about Vietnam. We're going to talk about that and several other things. But those are the three topics that we're going to cover this week in our lectures themselves. Now, Korea is closely tied up with the outbreak or the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War is a 50-year-long conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that actually never turned into a conflict, which is where the term Cold War comes from. If you think of a normal war as a hot war, as in people are fighting and angry at each other, a Cold War is a war, but there's no actual engagement and fighting between the two powers. And in fact, the Soviet Union and the United States never do go to war, although several different groups supported by the United States and the Soviet Union go to war on multiple occasions. This would include in North Korea and South Korea. This would include North and South Vietnam, Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, and several other groups around the world. So there are certainly conflicts that go along with the Cold War, but there's never any active fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, to really properly explain the story of Korea and the Korean War, we need to go back to 1945 and the end of World War II. So as we're familiar with, the atomic weapons ended the war with Japan, but you'll remember that I mentioned in that lecture that the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan, and actually a Soviet army group had rolled across the Japanese border of Manchuria and took over almost all of Manchuria and had pressed all the way down into the Korean Peninsula. The reason for this is the Japanese forces in Manchuria had been almost entirely removed. They were in China or back on the home islands preparing for a U.S. invasion. So there was almost no one in the Russians' path. And the Russians made it all the way to the 38th parallel in the Korean Peninsula before they were stopped. Excuse me, not the 38th parallel. Let's see. I think it's the 53rd parallel now that I speak it. No, it is the 30th parallel. My bad, 38th parallel. I was right initially. I should have gone with what was up here. So the Soviets stopped at the 38th parallel upon hearing news that the Japanese had surrendered. And so the southern part of Korea was still occupied by the Japanese. And the Japanese withdrew from Korea over the next few months as the surrender agreement took effect. The United States and the United Nations, which both the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were all technically members of, took control over the southern part of Korea, not necessarily permanently, but to help the Koreans transition into their own government. The Soviet Union, however, never left North Korea, and in fact, in the end agreement of World War II, there was never really any negotiation between the United States and the Soviet Union on what they were going to do about North and South Korea, and the Russians certainly did not have any intention of leaving. And in fact, the Russians oversaw the election, or the not the election, the appointment, maybe would be a better way to say it, of a communist leader in North Korea. And so North Korea becomes a communist nation, whereas South Korea is being organized to self-determine, or in other words, determine for itself what is going to go on. Now remember, I've mentioned on multiple occasions that in 1945, the United States did not consider the Soviet Union an overwhelming threat. This often surprises people, and specifically President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who of course passed away in April of 1945, was, and many historians have mentioned this, and I concur, he was naive. Or in other words, he had a high view of the Soviet Union, and he probably should have distrusted them a little bit more than he did, because the Soviet Union, at the end of the day, I would trust about as far as I could throw it. And considering that Russia is the biggest country on earth and the Soviet Union was the biggest nation on earth, that's not very far. So President Roosevelt trusted Stalin a lot, and he thought that Churchill was a little bit of a worrywart, which Churchill certainly in some ways seemed to be a worrywart. He seemed to see Soviet evil and Soviet bad intention all over the place, except the reality was Churchill was right and FDR was actually in the wrong. He should not have trusted Stalin as much as he did, and he should have gone with Winston Churchill's thoughts. Remember, we even talked about this in the planning of where to open a second front against the Nazis. Churchill supported the Italian invasion and wanted a Greek invasion primarily so that the United States and Britain could stop the Soviet Union from conquering so much of Eastern Europe, which unfortunately, because of the failure of the Italian invasion to move quickly and the fact that the United States elected instead to go into France, the Soviet Union did conquer most of Eastern Europe, and much to no one's surprise, the Soviet Union announced that all of the countries they had liberated had, in recognition of how awesome they were, elected communist leaders rather than democratic leaders. And of course, this was all really a front for the fact that the Soviet Union had taken all of these places over, and they didn't have an option. In fact, the Czechs and the Hungarians would both attempt to rebel against the Soviet Unions, and just to show how popular the communists were there, the Soviets sent tanks and army divisions in to pacify both of these regions. So effectively, the Soviet Union invaded and set up communist leaders, whether the people wanted them or not. A very similar situation went on in North Korea. Again, the United States seemed largely naive to this until 1947, when it was finally apparent that the Soviet Union was not actually having fair elections. What the Soviet Union claimed was that the people of these nations were self-determining to be communist. And in good American fashion, one of the points that I agree with Woodrow Wilson in is the idea that people should be allowed to self-determine their type of government. I agree with that. Our own nation is founded on the principles of government for the people and by the people, and so we, our own people, have determined our government, and I do support that idea for everybody else. So I think the Americans were naive for good reasons. I think they wanted people to govern themselves. I think they wanted to have that going on. But the Soviets weren't actually doing that. What the Soviets were doing is they were picking people that would be loyal to Moscow, and they were placing them in charge. And then finally, in 1947, this became clear to the United States. Now, the United States had several issues or entangling problems with the Soviet Union that it was going to need to deal with, and deal with relatively quickly. Number one, the city of Berlin was well within Soviet-occupied territory in Germany. The Allies, after the end of World War II, occupied Germany and split it into 4 separate zones, the largest of which was the Soviet Union zone, and then the other 3 zones were controlled by the British, the French, and the United States. The United States, France, and Britain elected to join their regions of Germany into one single nation, and this is the nation that we oftentimes call West Germany for this period of history, but effectively this is the modern German state, and the area controlled by the Soviet Union is often called East Germany. But if you look on a map, not only from the 1950s, but you can tell this from a modern map of Germany, the city of Berlin is actually pretty far to the east, and the city of Berlin was completely surrounded by territory controlled by the Soviet Union. In an attempt to force the Americans to leave Berlin and therefore increase their own legitimacy, the Soviets attempted to force the Americans and British and French out of Berlin, which was also, by the way, divided into 4 sections, 3 of which were controlled by the Allies, by completely cutting off land access to the city. And the hope was that the United States would be forced to either back down or militarily intervene. And the Soviet Army's presence was so strong in Germany that Russia knew that the United States could not possibly mount an attack on the Soviet Union and expect to win. And by the way, by that point in 1945, the Soviet Union demonstrated their ability to use atomic weapons, and they had dropped their first atom bomb, program, by the way, largely stolen from the United States. Soviet spies had infiltrated Los Alamos and other locations in the United States, and they had stolen the information needed to make atomic weaponry. And so much to everyone's surprise in 1949, not only did the Soviet Union protect to possess nuclear weapons, but it was now basically daring the United States into combat. And the United States could not rely on its nuclear capability to drive the Russians out, because the Russians had the same capability to use on the Americans. But the Americans actually outsmarted the Russians in this conflict, and rather than engage with the Russian army, they simply flew supplies into Berlin. This is called the Berlin Airlift, and hundreds of thousands of supplies, pounds of supplies, were flown into the Germans living in Berlin. And effectively, many Germans said that the quality of their food improved during the airlift than it had been beforehand. And many Germans have mentioned with glee the huge piles of candy that the Americans dropped in. Most Europeans did not consider candy an essential, and the Americans said, yeah, candy's an essential, we're going to fly it in for them. And so the kids remember being distributed all of these pieces of candy that the Americans flew in for them. So that was a major propaganda victory for the United States, and the Soviet Union realized that they could not isolate Berlin, and they were forced to come to an agreement with the Allies to allow road access to Berlin, and that territory technically they relinquished to the Allies so that they could continue to supply Berlin that way. But again, the capability of supplying Berlin by air was possessed by the Allies, and that surprised the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is unknown what level of influence they had on North Korea and the North Korean decision in 1950 to invade South Korea. The reason that North Korea chose to do this was because South Korea had just been reorganized into a democratic state. Again, South Korea was allowed to determine for themselves what they wanted to do, and while there was a South Korean Communist Party, they had lost badly in the determination elections, and it looked like the Democrats, the liberal Democrats, were going to win and form a new democratic nation. And by the way, I use liberal Democrats in the sense of classical liberalism, meaning the ideas that were held by many of the American founders. I don't mean in the modern political wrangling of conservative and liberal. I mean true liberalism. The North Koreans claimed that there was election interference, and because they're just so nice, they were going to come in and make sure the right guy got put in charge. And of course, the right guy in this case was the Communist Party. And the intention was, of course, for that Communist Party to announce a reunification of Korea, all under the North Korean Communist government. The problem is that the United States and its allies were not going to allow that. The United States had effectively guaranteed the right of self-determination by Korea, and so was forced by its treaty obligations to intervene. The South Koreans were quickly pushed down to a very limited stronghold on the south end of the Korean Peninsula, while the United States mobilized its troops, and after almost 4 months, the United States invaded Korea and pushed the North Koreans back over the entire North Korean peninsula. In fact, the United States' campaign was so effective that by the middle of 1951, the North Koreans had actually lost almost the entirety of their territory. And in fact, they were being pushed back across the Chinese borders. And this is where the Korean War gets more complicated. The Chinese had been undergoing a civil war all the way since the 1930s. The Communist Chinese, supplied by the Soviet Union, had been mounting a rural insurrection against the nationalist Chinese, the actual government of China, and this war had been going back and forth all the way from the early 1930s to about 1939. In 1939, China was being badly defeated by the Japanese. Remember, we talked about the rape of Nanking or Nanjing, and the communists and the nationalists decided to bury the hatchet and work together to try and get rid of the Japanese. In this case, the enemy of my enemy is my friend is the adage that's there, okay? So the communists didn't like the Japanese, and the nationalists didn't like the Japanese, and so they decided to work together to try and end the Japanese threat. The problem with this is that the nationalist government exhausted itself in the war against China, and the communists at first aided the nationalists in driving the communists out of the northern territories of China. But as soon as the communists had driven the Japanese out of their own territory, they began to stockpile weapons that began to increasingly pour in from the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union ended its war with Nazi Germany, it began to pour all of those weapons that it had been producing for the war into communist China. Meanwhile, nationalist China was exhausting itself winning the war against the Japanese, and as soon as the war ended officially, the peace was signed, the communists broke their truce with the nationalists and attacked them in a massive wave across the entire country. In 4 years of brutal fighting, the nationalist Chinese were pushed all the way to the island of Taiwan, recently returned to China from Japan, and on that island the nationalist Chinese would survive, but they lost all of mainland China. And so today, when we talk about the island of Taiwan is actually officially called the Republic of China. with a red and blue flag with a star on it, if you want to look it up. And the mainland China is the People's Republic of China, which is, of course, not a republic, and it's not for the people, but it is China, so it is actually a communist state controlled by the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party, or the Chinese Communist Party, excuse me. And that Chinese Communist Party in 1950 and 51 was the closest allies of the North Koreans. While Russia does technically share a land border with North Korea's actions apparently did not warrant Soviet intervention. And the Soviets, while protesting that the war was unjust and that the North Koreans had actually been in the right, which almost everyone agrees they were not, the Russians had not actually intervened in the war. I think for several reasons. Number one, I think their atomic program in 1949 and 1950 was much more for show than reality. The United States had hundreds of nuclear weapons that they could deploy in a number of different ways. No missiles yet. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Cold War in general in our in-class discussion. But the United States had real nuclear weapons capability, whereas the Soviet Union, I think, just had the capability for show. Again, the United States in 1945 had only had 3 functional weapons in July and August, and it took them a while to ramp up production. So the Soviet Union was struggling to ramp that production up. So I don't think they felt like they could militarily intervene, and I think the North Koreans had stepped out of line and the Soviet Union didn't feel any need to save them. Unfortunately, the Americans made a tactical mistake, which was followed up by a political lack of will. And I don't want to say a political mistake, so I'll explain what I mean by that. The tactical mistake was that General MacArthur, who was leading all of the UN forces in North Korea, primarily United States troops, but also British, Australian, Canadian, and so on, General MacArthur decided to push across the North Korean boundary with China and attack Chinese positions because the North Korean army was actually regrouping behind these Chinese army positions and were going to counterattack. So MacArthur wisely said that I am going to eliminate the North Koreans as a threat. He asked for permission from the president, President Truman, to use nuclear weapons. China did not possess nuclear weapons, and with the usage of nuclear weapons, he could destroy all Chinese bases, and he could actually push all the way into China. And, in fact, I think in MacArthur's mind, he could take over all of China with nuclear weapons. Would that be possible? That's really hard to determine. I think the idea from MacArthur was we'll push into China, the nationalist Chinese will assist us, and there will be a mass uprising against the communists, and perhaps China will go back to being a democratic, and I say that with quotation marks because nationalist China was not very democratic, but it will go back to being a democratic nation. Truman does not want to do this, and again, this is why I do not want to call this a mistake, because certainly the Communist Party of China, the CCP, has proved an enduring American problem. And today, China is posed as the counterpoint to the United States, and they've caused a number of problems. And again, not the Chinese people, different. Chinese people are great. They're people, just like everybody else on the planet. But the communist Chinese, the Chinese Communist Party, have caused serious problems for the United States. So maybe it would have been better had MacArthur invaded China. What Truman was afraid of wasn't just the stigma of being bogged down in China, which again, if the United States did take China, it would have been very, very difficult. But would this action finally draw the Russians into the war? The Russians hadn't gotten involved in the war so far when it was against North Korea. Would the Russians back their Chinese allies? Now, eventually the Soviet Union and China had a diplomatic break in the late 60s, early 70s, but that had not occurred yet, and there was a real question about whether China would be supported by the Soviet Union. So Truman refused to authorize nuclear weapons. MacArthur spoke out against what he thought was Truman's bad decision, and Truman fired MacArthur for that action. In response to the buildup of American troops just shy of the Chinese border, the Chinese decided to launch a preemptive attack, and millions of Chinese soldiers poured into North Korea and pushed the Americans almost back to their original starting point. The next years of the war, from 1951 to 1953, were a stalemate between the American, North Korean, and Chinese forces. And the pushback between the two eventually led to a settling of the original Soviet conquest line of the 38th parallel as the border between a democratic South Korea and a communist North Korea. And that border, by the way, still exists today. Several interesting facts about this war. Number one, this is the only time the United States and China have ever openly fought each other, and it was in the Korean Peninsula, not on either of their own territories. And in some ways, it was a limited war. The United States did not fight China in Chinese territory, even though we had the capability of doing so. We did not bomb China anywhere else but North Korea. So it was a limited war between the United States and China simply in the North Korean area. The U.S. has technically not ended the Korean War. The Korean War was ended by armistice in 1953, but technically North Korea and South Korea are still at war, and since the United States is a South Korean ally, that means that technically the state of hostilities between the U.S. and North Korea is still open. Technically, again, this exists in a technical sense. It's not like we're fighting any battles, and we haven't since 1953, but yet in technicality that war is still open. And of course, in modern times, especially the last 4 years, North Korea's exact relationship with the United States and China has come up more and more often. President Trump has opened up negotiations with the leader of North Korea, and they have been the most profitable negotiations at any time since 1953. And in addition, when I'm taping this, there's even a big scare about whether the leader of North Korea is dead, Kim Jong-un. He went in for surgery a few days before I recorded this, and he has not been seen since. So there's even the possibility right now that North Korea and South Korea's status might change. And if the North Korean leader is dead, because the way North Korea is structured, it's been led by the same family its entire history. If he is dead, we might be seeing a radical change to the Korean Peninsula, possibly even a unification of North and South Korea, which would be hard to imagine, but certainly possible. This uneasy ceasefire in 1953 ended the war. And again, it was a tie. Neither side really won, and the status quo was maintained. So in that sense, the United States was successful in its original stated intention. So it was a United States success as far as its intention to safeguard the democratic rule of South Korea. Success. But it was a failure in the sense of containing global communism. North Korea survived as a communist state, and communist China was also surviving as a state, and in fact was emboldened by the fact that they had engaged with American units and they had been successful. Again, the Chinese had used the familiar Russian tactic of overwhelming the U.S. with numbers. The numbers that the Chinese could put into the field was simply staggering, and since the United States had resolved not to use its nuclear weapons, China in some ways had an advantage, certainly when it came to manpower, though not technology. And so this was an interesting engagement between the two. Global tensions started to run extremely high because both the United States and the Soviet Union soon demonstrated their ability to produce hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs are the next evolution of atomic bombs and contain factors of energy more than their atomic counterparts. A single hydrogen bomb could wipe out the entirety of a city, not simply relying on the firebomb effect that the smaller atomic bombs had, but they could detonate huge areas. They could wipe cities clean, and it became more and more apparent throughout the 1950s that both the Soviet Union and the United States were developing weapons that could wipe each other off the face of the planet. Again, we'll talk about this in detail when we discuss the Cold War and its ramifications, but this is going to make every conflict after Korea a little bit more tense, because if the United States and the Soviet Union actually got to shooting at each other with atomic weapons, nobody would be left. This is called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. In our next lecture, we'll discuss what in many people's opinion is the closest the United States and Soviet Union ever got to exchanging those nuclear weapons, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The closest the world has gotten, at least so far, to destroying itself in nuclear Armageddon. Fortunately, it didn't happen, but it's definitely worth talking about.